So my name is Ashley Moyes. I'm the McDonald Postdoctoral Fellow in Christian Ethics and Public Life. We're entering into our next session, which we have Amy Wax and Joanna Williams. Amy is the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the author of What Can't Be Debated on Campus in the Wall Street Journal. Her paper today is entitled The Threat to Academic Values from the Quest for Diversity and Equal Rights. And Joanna Williams is the head of education at Policy Exchange, the author of Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and former director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Kent. She'll be speaking about academic freedom and identity. Can we speak freely about gender? I'll give it over to Amy.
Okay, I'm going to do a sit down also because my eyesight's not good enough to talk from standing up. And no PowerPoint. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to begin with a brief account of my recent experiences at Penn Law School, which drew me into this whole dissident community, and then try to draw some broader lessons from that experience for the future of the academy and society as a whole. My strange saga began on August 9th of 2018 when I published an op-ed with San Diego law professor Larry Alexander in our local newspaper, the Philly Inquirer, entitled Paying the Price for the Breakdown of the Country's Bourgeois Culture. And I agreed to go in on this article at Larry's invitation. I didn't think much about it. The piece listed some of the ills currently afflicting American society, and it suggested that a renewed embrace of so-called bourgeois values, that well-worn cultural script for mature adulthood that prevailed before the 1960s, might help relieve some of our problems. In what became perhaps the most controversial passage, we pointed out that all cultures are not equal. Some are more successful than others in preparing people to be productive in modern technological societies. And in an interview the next day about the op-ed in our school newspaper, the Daily Pennsylvanian, I defended the assertion that some cultures are better. Functionally superior was the term I used with the student reporter. That term never made it into the article. By pointing out how people vote with their feet, I noted that global migrants flock to mostly white, mostly European countries, and they don't risk their lives in rickety boats to go to Venezuela or Zimbabwe. Our piece and my statements evoked an immediate firestorm in the media, from the public, from various quarters of academia. Groups at Penn and elsewhere labeled me a racist, bigot, white supremacist, xenophobe, hater, that familiar litany of accusatory terms. A group of my colleagues published a piece immediately criticizing our praise of the 1950s on the ground that that era was irredeemably evil, and we had in fact acknowledged some of the shortcomings in our piece. A flimsy argument, but at least an argument. But not long afterward, 33 of my colleagues, half of our faculty at the law school, signed a so-called open letter in the school paper that, quote, condemned and categorically rejected all my views. And this letter had no argument, no explanation, no reasons, and it didn't even specify the views that were being rejected. To be sure, this letter was criticized by a number of people in the comments section, so the main instigator, our local little Torquemada, decided to post a rambling 15,000-word refutation of our tiny little op-ed on the website Heterodox Academy. And I really have read it several times, but I still can't summarize the argument, which is rather rambling and incoherent. In response to that, I asked the instigator the following hypothetical, and as you know, lawyers traffic in hypotheticals. I asked him whether he would rather live in a neighborhood where most people abided by the bourgeois precepts or where most didn't. He answered me, I categorically refuse to answer that hypothetical. I do data, not hypotheticals. I have argued before our own United States Supreme Court, and I can assure you that the Chief Justice would not be amused by such an answer. In any event, he never explained to me why it was necessary to gang up and publicly condemn me Indeed, none of my colleagues offered any explanation. To be sure, one told me angrily on the street that the damage I had inflicted on Penn Law had ruined his summer. Another said that the open letter was necessary to, quote, get my attention so I would never, ever write anything like that again. None of the responses that I got, and there were not very many, were friendly to dissent, to say the least. They were unrelentingly hostile. And then, last December, my own dean, Dean Ted Ruger, came into my office, sat down, and asked me to take a leave for the following year, saying that perhaps that would relieve some of the pressure on him to fire me. I refused. When I reported our conversation in a Wall Street Journal op-ed last February, he immediately publicly denied that we had had that conversation. Dear reader, I assure you that we had. And then he sent me an irate email from his iPhone stating, Amy, you're a liar. Now, what do these events tell us? I believe they show how the key rules of the road for academic discourse, and that is what I would call it, rules like engaging in civil debate, giving reasoned justifications for positions, not calling names or using slurs, being honest and forthright, and I think the latter is the one that in some ways is the most important. My dean's lie was highly arresting for me, a conversion experience. These rules were routinely violated at my school, and they are increasingly violated at other universities. And as we know, it's all in a good cause, advancing the progressive agenda. And let me return to this idea of academic values. I am not talking here about the First Amendment, which, as I noted earlier, limits only public and not private institutions. That's an important distinction. The public-private one is very vital in our system because it helps reduce and limit the government's power to control our lives. But this means that technically private institutions in the United States can censor all they want, or at least up until recently, they could censor all they want with the Trump initiatives, and their significance, I think, is up for grabs. But I argue that they should not. They should give the widest possible ambit to dissent because that is essential to their educational mission. And I will not elaborate further because this morning there were several eloquent defenses of open, rigorous, wide-open debate in the university, and we can perhaps engage that in the Q&A. Now, who is responsible for the hostility to dissent in the American Academy today? Well, as we already know, it is the progressive left, which overwhelmingly dominates. And what that means is that increasingly in America, both in the university but also in K through 12, and that is worth discussing, power and politics determines who get to speak and what they get to say. Universities are no longer sites of free and fearless inquiry, they are sites of orthodoxy. And Jonathan Haidt on Heterodox Academy sums it up well in fact, in response to my colleague's open letter condemning me, which he in turn criticized. Quote, every open letter you sign to condemn a colleague for his or her words brings us closer to a world in which academic disagreements are resolved by social force and political persuasion, not by, by social force and political power, not by argumentation and persuasion. And that is the world that we are perilously close to today. Now that brings me to the core subject of my talk and the denouement of my story. Some time after the op-ed was published, student activists at Penn Law, the Black Law Students Association, were looking for dirt on me. They spent a lot of time they should have been in the library studying, doing this. They unearthed and then complained about a Blogging Heads podcast I made 7 months previously at the invitation of Brown University economist Glenn Loury, who is himself black. During that podcast, and I've made several with Glenn Loury, I made the point that racism was an implausible explanation for the disparities often observed between minorities and other law students, for example, in obtaining prestigious judicial clerkships or lucrative partnerships. Rather, student performance, student grades were a better explanation. He then introduced the topic of affirmative action. I then said, and these were the words objected to, that I could not recall any black students at Penn Law graduating at the very top of the class, and that I rarely remembered any scoring in the top half of my own first-year civil procedure class, which I had taught for over 20 years. And I was drawing on my classroom experience, as well as my tenure on the clerkship committee, my attendance at graduation. I went on to speculate that affirmative action overplaces minority students, and that's an uphill battle for them. These are the observations that went viral. The students launched a renewed campaign to have me fired or to remove me from teaching a mandatory first-year class. The dean immediately acquiesced and announced the decision in an email to the entire Penn Law community, an email which he kept secret from me. It is instructive to contemplate what his message said, because it is emblematic of the way these discussions are conducted today. He claimed that my assertions, which he mischaracterized, were inaccurate, were false, my assertions about my students. But in typical Catch-22 fashion, he offered no data to back up the claim, and he hasn't until this day. And then he stated that the school doesn't collect information on performance by race anyway, begging the question of how he knew I was wrong. He said I violated confidentiality policies, but cited none. Most tellingly for our purposes, he stated the following: black students assigned to my mandatory class, quote, may reasonably wonder whether their professor has come to conclusions about their presence, performance, and potential for success, and may legitimately question whether the belittling statements she made will adversely affect their learning environment. The key assertion here is that the supposedly belittling statements I made, which the dean insisted were inaccurate, might adversely affect the learning environment. Now, it is worth asking, what does this mean, and how do we gauge such effects? Can such effects be examined objectively? Do minority students in my class earn lower grades than others in first-year classes? Do they learn less, somehow measured through their performance, than they do in other civil procedure classes, for example? Well, the notion that I actively penalize my students is a non-starter because first-year grading is blind in our school, a fact that the dean omitted to mention. So far, no effort has been made to investigate the evidence on my performance as a teacher. And I predict that none will be made because facts are beside the point. The beauty of the dean's email, his allegations, is that facts don't matter. His message was a fact-free zone. What is important are perceptions and feelings. So what does this mean? Well, professors who hold unpopular positions are psychologically toxic, and if their presence causes offense, distress, hurt, insult, fears of ill treatment, that is enough to eject them from the classroom. These perceptions are subjective, they're self-confirming, and they are thus immune to challenge. The mind of the beholder is all that matters. The mind of the beholder reigns supreme. Well, it takes only a moment to realize that this kind of step, this kind of ploy, amounts to a weapon of mass destruction for penalizing professors who hold unorthodox views or discuss distressing realities, and the possibilities are endless. Objections based on discomfort, psychological harm, can be concocted from a host of observations. The list is long. The professor supports Trump, believes that colonialism was sometimes a positive good, that women are less interested in science on average, that illegals should be deported, on and on. Which brings me to the topic of the quest for equality of results, which I believe is grievously eroding academic values today. I submit that the aggressive, dogmatic pursuit of equality and equality of outcomes for groups has become an item of faith in the academy, at least in the United States. The pursuit of that goal, which is central to the obsession with identity, diversity, and inclusion, threatens the core of the academic enterprise by casting a pall of orthodoxy on thought and speech in many areas culturally dominated by the elite, and this is not just the university, but it's seeped out into the media, into the professions, big business, and the like. Why is that? The notion that we must embrace and affirm equality of results, of talent, of ability, results in the twisting, hiding, and distortion of reality, of facts, and the punishment of those who point to and discuss them. David Azarad at the Heritage Society puts it well. In the service of equal results, all right-thinking people are constrained to, quote, denounce the mistreatment of designated groups at the hands of an unjust society, and to praise their accomplishments and their achievements, whether real or fake, genuine or fabricated. And of course, the accuracy of his words is reflected in the firestorm response to my statements and observations about bourgeois values, about cultural differences, about black student performance, about the downsides of affirmative action. Ideas about group differences and observations about possible sources of those differences must be suppressed unless they are made to fit a dominant narrative, which is that ours is an irredeemably racist and sexist society, and all group differences and disparities flow from external causes, specifically from nefarious discrimination. Now, correct thinking on racial preferences, which are extremely important in our country, is even more baroque and self-contradictory. Fundamental precept: all virtuous people accept that affirmative action is good and necessary. But the academic gaps that make it necessary, although often glaringly obvious, may not be mentioned in polite company, as I mentioned them, or are illusory, or are the product of racism, or, as a last ditch, they are amenable to instant correction through the offices of racial preferences, services, programs, and initiatives without end. Indeed, central to the practice of affirmative action today in universities and beyond is a tenacious myth, which I have elsewhere dubbed the central myth of affirmative action. Once beneficiaries arrive at their institution of higher learning, they instantly catch up, and group differences disappear. And any suggestion that performance gaps often persist is reconfigured as an attack on minority students themselves, as harmful, as hurtful, and as an assertion of their inferiority. In the climate that prevails in the university, this set of rhetorical moves, and especially the recourse to the harm principle, which is basically all we can all agree on, right? This set of rhetorical moves amounts to the position that affirmative action is untouchable. And the evasions that surround affirmative action are just part of a broader pattern that has taken over on many fronts. Group differences in academic performance, workplace success, rates of school discipline, wealth, home ownership, credit and lending, the list goes on, can never be attributed to anything victims do or choose, to behavior, to performance. Examples are everywhere. For example, Heather McDonald has recently noted that patterns of school discipline, higher rates for minority boys, must not be attributed to gaps in actual behavior, in rates of offending, even though there is good evidence for such differences. Rather, the only acceptable explanation is racism. Ditto for lending and home mortgages, and everything else on the list. Which brings us back to affirmative action and how we're allowed to talk about it. The irony here is that, like a good conservative, I think private institutions should have the admissions policies they want and let the chips fall where they may. But in our society today, they are not allowed to fall. The hopes for group equality that grow out of affirmative action don't stop at the schoolhouse door. They feed into elaborate taboos, charades, and untruths that pervade society as a whole. The problem is, of course, that some people resent having to tell untruths with a gun to their head. This regime is humiliating and unfair. The distortion of the truth is an important source of our political divide. Now, he tells me that I have only 5 minutes. So I'm going to highlight one of the elements that I think is worthy of discussion. And that is how this parlance, this unanswerable parlance of the grievance culture, gets perpetuated. This rhetoric of feelings, of upset, of disrespect. In the United States, the main perpetrators, or an important set of perpetrators of this grievance parlance, are the students themselves. Peer pressure is powerful, and many students in the United States are completely cowed. They are terrified by being called out by their fellow students. They know that when they do call out their fellow students, call names, issue slurs, that those in authority will not question them. Those in authority will back them up. Indeed, I am regularly struck by the refusal of people, part of the university brass, to ever remonstrate with students. The university is replete with diversity bureaucrats who not only don't defend students who are attacked by their peers, but pile on. They stand ready to monitor attitudes, receive complaints, and guard sensitivity. And they have a whole list of taboo subjects and the like. So what can be done about this? Well, I want to talk small and I want to talk large about the measures that I think are the most promising. In retail, in my own classes, I have 3 rules. And here are the rules. First, no one is allowed to say, "I'm offended." You may be offended, you may feel offended, but you can't say it. The second rule, no one can call anyone living or dead, inside or outside the classroom, racist, sexist, xenophobic, or any of those ist terms, including, as a friend of mine said, bassoonist or oboist. Thirdly, what occurs in the class stays in the class. No complaining to bureaucrats or administrators. If you don't agree to these 3 rules, don't take the class. Now, obviously, it's very unlikely that these rules will be adopted across the board, but what I really want to argue is that just a few simple rules of the road, which are not equivalent to free speech, indeed quite the opposite, right, can do a world of good, and they have done a world of good in my classroom. The second big idea, right, relates to what can be done. Well, I have a project going now, and the more I look into it, the harder it seems, called Defund the Ivies. People in the United States are terribly fond, moneyed people, of throwing large sums of money at selective universities. The reasons for this are complex. They have a lot to do with snobbery, with wanting to situate their children favorably to get into these schools, to get out of these schools, to remain in the upper middle class or join the upper middle class. It's a very complex problem with many, many layers. But I think the key to defunding the Ivies, if it's going to be anything like a success, is to impress upon wealthy people that there are better uses of their money than just comforting the comfortable, which is really what giving money to the Ivy League amounts to in the present climate. And that is to think very, very hard about what ordinary, unspecial people, the neglected, the ignored in our society need. I guess I would call them the deplorables. And I would invite you, in the 1 minute I have remaining, to think about how to help the deplorables. And I don't mean the people at the very bottom, because they earn outsized amounts of solicitude, the so-called extremely disadvantaged. I mean the ordinary, middle-of-the-road people who never get close to a selective university, and the data on this, of course, are striking. The percentage of American college students that go to universities that accept less than 50% of their applicants is in the single digits, an astonishing figure that I wasn't aware of. How can we help those people right in the middle? How can we help the Trump voters? If we could convince the big finance guys, the fat cats, the wealthy and the rich, that they ought to be helping those people and aiding them and supporting them somehow and not giving another $50 million to Princeton, I think we would have accomplished a lot. Thank you.